this is interesting because it's... Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs. This is Chuck Mason, and we'd like to welcome Patricia Walls Stamm. Welcome. I'm so glad you could come to the show today. She is a professional genealogist, and today we're going to be talking about lists and directories and the kinds of things that a little bit beyond the standard census records that everybody knows to look at. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with city directories. Many people overlook these because they don't think there's any kind of genealogical information in them. But the city directories are great because they are published on a yearly basis for the most part. And they are self-correcting. So one year you may have somebody misspelled with a name, but the next year it's corrected into the right spelling.
The other thing we want to point out that a city directory was what they used before they had telephone books.
Correct.
And occasionally you'll still find city directories after phones were common, but they certainly became far, far less common after that.
Right. We have a picture of a city directory for the graphic. And in it, you'll see a listing of all of the Stamms. This is from St. Louis. And you'll see a listing of the names of the individual along with the spouse that is in parentheses with their residence and sometimes their work occupation and address. Now, what we end up doing here is if a son or daughter is working, they will have a separate entry in it. Let me start off by saying, in earlier city directories before 1920, what would happen is only women would appear in the city directories if they were widowed. So there was no tying the two together. But you were telling us earlier, Arlene, about the city directory that you found.
Well, I think it was Enid, Oklahoma, but it listed not, like you said, it was listed the husband and the wife and what each one did and the daughter, and listed her as a student. So now I never looked up whether the wife was listed separately. That didn't occur to me because I thought it would be only head of household. But that was interesting. And the other thing I wanted to point out, because most of what we're talking about is U.S. oriented, that city directories do exist for many, many European cities. Whether they're online or not, I don't know. Some of them maybe, some of them maybe not, but I do know that the Library of Congress has many of them. Right. And I don't know whether the Library of Congress has done anything about putting that kind of thing online.
I'm not aware of anything online at the Library of Congress. It's mainly Ancestry.com, I know, has some, Fold3 has some. And I had a friend who found a very interesting entry for a widow. She was trying to find the death date of one of her ancestors, and it was before death certificates were done in the area, and I don't remember what the deal was about the cemetery, but lo and behold, she found the cemetery entry for the widow, and it said, of course, widow of the name, who died on and gave his exact death date.
Oh,
now that's unusual, but you know, that's something, and a lot of it had to do with the criteria of who was the publisher, what went into them, because there were about 3 or 4. Pokes and Godspells, I believe it was pronounced, were 2 of the big ones, but I've found others in smaller areas, that other companies that publish them.
Well, city directories, even though we talk about them as city directories, what was great about them is they had so much wealth of information. They told about the city and projects that they had done that week or that year. They also talked about the streetcar lines and what boats would service the area or rail lines would service the area, or who was elected that particular year and how the wards were broken out. So there was a lot of great information.
And also lots of like listings by occupation, businesses, churches, cemeteries, things like that. And just to point out, I run into a case where when they've microfilmed these, they didn't always necessarily microfilm those sections. I had used city directories in Philadelphia and then wanted to go look for something else which would have been in the business section of the directory at the Library of Congress, and I went down there, and the business section was not microfilmed. And I thought, now I know I have copies of some of these pages, and then I realized I was actually using the actual directory, the paper directory at the Historical Society.
Now, did
Yes.
they have something called pink pages?
Well, I refer to them as pink pages, and we have an example of that also. And this was in the books after 1925-26 in St. Louis. And what this did was give a listing of all of the cross streets, and in it you would have a listing of all of the neighbors. I always used to say to my, and here's the example, one of the things that I used to say to my students is if you could not find your relatives in the census, go into the pink pages and look for the neighbors, and then do a search on the neighbors, because a lot of the times your relative may not have their name misspelled or whatever, but you could always find a neighbor.
That seemed to break it down by address. It gave an address,
Yes.
and then everybody that lived at that address, you couldn't really see it on the screen, but you can see that some of it is indented a little bit, and that's where the particular address would
Yes.
have been then.
Yes, so you have the cross streets and all of the addresses, so that made it easy.
And then you have historical references as well.
Oh, the historic references, there's a lot of those out there. In Missouri, we have what we call the Blue Books, and these are books that are published yearly. Some of the states have them, they're different colors, but they're historic records of employees of the state government. And you would have a listing of their police department and recorder of deeds and all the way down the line.
Are these in all states?
I know we have them in the Midwest because I've used several of them before.
I'm not aware of them. This was something new. I have a great uncle who was a policeman in Louisiana, so at some point I'll be checking to see if Louisiana had
Well, I was just wondering whether I'm in one, because I've never heard of something like that, but I work for Northern Virginia Community College, so that's a state employee.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably the Library of Virginia would be the place to look for that for
Now,
Virginia.
Now, what we ended up doing is our archivist has put these up online. So several of the older editions are available through the Secretary of State office.
Well, we were talking earlier about things and things that are and aren't online, and one of the problems is copyright laws.
Yes, very much so. It's funny because when we were up at the Library of Congress the other day, the archivist in the newspaper room was saying that even though the Library of Congress has the newspapers up to 1922, they're not putting anything later than that at this point, based on the fact that they have copyright issues.
Oh, the newspaper copyright.
Mm-hmm. Because it is by a publisher, and it is their rights to publish what they want or what they don't want. And we run into that all the time with historic books up online, you know?
Somehow you think that once it's published in a newspaper, it's public, and, you know, because it's gone to everybody, that anybody could copy something like that if they wanted to. I mean, I understand the copyrights every place else, but somehow not the newspaper.
I understand. There's just so many lists out there, and I don't think people really think about it. A lot of them are tied to professions. I have one list here of ministers, and the listing showed when they were in that particular college and when they left that college to go into a different region, and it even told us the region that they went into.
And the police, you had that one too.
Yes.
Who was in employ? Okay, there's the Presbyterian one. You highlighted one. You can't, so anyway, there's two different lists there. One is showing the police who who worked for the police department. But and again, where do you find all of these? In the local historical societies? Or?
It could be the local historical societies or your local library. Go and ask them if they have a state list of employees or state list of whatever. What we end up doing is a lot of the times we will go in and put in, I know that sounds funny, in WorldCat such a term as druggist in Cincinnati. And you will have a listing of all of the druggists that are in Cincinnati in a certain year, or all of the doctors, or even lawyers.
Yeah, I was online once and I was looking for something in St. Louis, and I came up with a doctor's list of all the births he attended. I mean, perhaps they didn't have birth certificates, but this was in the 1800s. But he kept his own list, and that was online. Oh my goodness! I mean, it's certainly not something that anybody would ever expect to look for, even.
No, not at all.
Well, of course, talking about directories, there are lots and lots of directories for professions. Two of the ones that I have used is the National Yellow Book of Funeral Directors, which covers not just the United States, but North America. And there's also a similar book on cemeteries. And fortunately, living close to the Library of Congress, they have the older editions. So if you have the name of a funeral home that doesn't exist today, or a cemetery that may not still be in operation, going back and looking at these older directories can give you location information, let you go back and find these places. And of course, you've talked about some others.
Well,
Let's
stay with the cemeteries and the funeral directors for a moment, if you will, because what ends up happening is the websites are the most current listing. And you brought up a very important point. You need to get into the older editions to see about name changes, and if funeral directors merged or were bought out or whatever. And a lot of the times, the older books are at the library versus the online edition.
Now, the other thing is, if you're looking for a Jewish cemetery, that Jewish Gin that had a list of, I don't know, it was 3,000 when I stopped doing it 15 years ago. But we collected all of the names of every cemetery where there were any Jewish burials, so all around the world. Now, they took that and they revamped it somehow, but and they're now taking pictures of some of the ones that still exist. But that included cemeteries that were on private property, or that no longer existed, where somebody knew this is the location of where they were. And they might show a picture of woods or something now. So that if you're looking for specifically Jewish ones, that's another location to look at.
There's one set of books that is very, very prominent out there, been published for a number of years, and it's called Who's Who. And we're all familiar with it.
Yes.
It could be something as Who's Who in baseball, or Who's Who in ministry, or Who's Who in women in the Midwest, or whatever. And you can, we have a copy of one, and these are women in the West, but it gave a little bit of a biography on each one of the individuals. Who's Who in railroading, and there is a great wealth of information in it. These were people that were prominent in their particular category, and again, these are books that are published and available at the library.
Well, the other thing, not just professions, I've run into, at least in New Jersey, where it's who's who in a particular county. And lo and behold, found two distant cousins. One had at one time the largest greenhouses in southern New Jersey. And this was my grandfather's father's aunt and uncle. And the other one was a little bit more distant cousin who happened to have a business. And of course, you have to take these with a little bit of grain of salt, because sometimes they are enhancing the story and all, but it often gives you a whole biography of maybe one generation, or it may give you two or 3 generations of family.
There's another one for Jewish women. Jewish women. It's more modern history. It doesn't go back to ancient times of famous Jewish people in Jewish history, but the who's who in women, who's famous women, Jewish women. Sally Ann, who's my co-host many times, is listed in that one. So it's a fairly modern book, probably 10 years old at this point or something. I don't know exactly. But yeah, sometimes, too often, you don't know even where to begin to look for something like that. And I think that's a bit of the problem.
One of the things that I start with more often than not right now is a website that is called worldcat.org. And it is the world catalog of various libraries across the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, some of Canada?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure what all. It definitely is the United States, but
and what you can do is you can just put in a term such as Mississippi River, and topics will come up with books that have the Mississippi River in it, or ministers, or in Missouri, or Alabama, or whatever, and it comes up with a listing. After you find a book that you're interested in, you click on the title of that book, and it gives you a little bit of a synopsis about the book, as well as the references of where it was published and when it was published. And then below that, you can put in your zip code, and it will give you a listing of libraries that are in your area, or how close that book is in relation to it. Now, if perchance that book is so far away from you that you can't get to it, what you can do is take the information and go to your local library and do an interlibrary loan. Okay.
Yeah, that's something else that I never heard about until I got into genealogy and started doing research. And one time I did try to get a book. It was referenced as a footnote in another book. And I tried to get that, and the answer came back, what do you want in there? Why are you asking for this book? Because obviously it was a pretty rare book. So I told them, and I specifically said, in this page, it referenced that page. They Xeroxed that page for me because it was a rare book and an old book, and obviously that library did not want to release it.
And of course, it's a great way. I mean, we're very fortunate living in the Northern Virginia area. We have good libraries, and we have the Library of Congress and the DAR library close by, but not everyone has these things, so it's a way of borrowing things and getting access to things that you would spend hundreds of dollars to make a trip to go and use. And it's relatively free or inexpensive. In some cases, they will ask that you pay the cost of sending the materials.
It's a couple of dollars. It's
very minimum. But the other thing is too, with all of these people out there digitizing books, like Google Books, or like Internet Archives, or even the college group is getting together under the Haiti Trust. You can go into such websites, Google Books, and put in directory of such and such, or directory of Missouri state employees, and see what comes up.
And that brings to mind something I mentioned earlier, and you had said I should mention this. One of the things I found on one of the paid sites that has city directories, when I looked at the directory page, I then went to the front to get the title page, and I found in several cases the description they gave in the listing was not the actual directory. I found this there were two 1924 Philadelphia City Directory listings. When I went to the title page of one of them, it was actually the 1922 directory, not the 1924. I had seen the 1924. So that points out it's important to make sure that when you get things like this, you go to get the information to do your source citation and make sure that you have it. an accurate source.
Well,
for it.
and I'll even bring up one other a point, and I apologize. I'm kind of telling on some of my students, but what ends up happening is they go into the city directories and they start looking at all of the abbreviations used, and they never understand, you know, what is a rear, because they had some of the houses had the front part and the back part, and they would classify it as a rear house. And so what we end up doing is we keep telling them, go to the front of the book to get the abbreviations. It makes it so much easier.
Well, part of that is just simply understanding the time in which the people lived, that you had rear apartments that didn't face the front at all, and where they had subdivided perhaps more fancy homes or something like that.
Well, the other thing I've run into too, not just things like that, but they will abbreviate locations. And if you know the area, you may look at something and say, well, gee, it could be this town or it could be this town. And I don't know for sure, so knowing that abbreviation, what did they abbreviate each of the towns as, can be helpful, because you can have them listed as one location. In reality, they're actually in another location.
Right.
So those abbreviations
Now,
are important.
if I may, just one more point. Chuck was talking earlier about his farm family and how they had a directory of farm families. And we continued on the discussion and said something about on some plat maps, okay,
Yes.
and those are prominent. You have a fantastic geography section down at the Library of Congress that I am in love with. But in the back of this one plat map, it had a listing of all of the landowners, like you have on the map, but it told where they came from and when they came into the county.
Oh, wow.
So it was fantastic.
So that means we may see you more often coming to the Library of Congress.
The Library of Congress Genealogy Department is always one of the places that I go visit.
I got a funny story about that. When we first started doing genealogy, Sally Ann and I, who was my co-host before Chuck, this was really in the early stages. I said, well, you want to go to the general reading room? And she looked at me, general reading room? I've never been in the general reading room. You go to the Jewish section. I mean, we approached it from totally different angles. There is so much there.
Yes.
Personally, my research was Germany, and in order to get to German records, you do go to the general reading room. Those records are not generally in Hebrew, which you would find in the Jewish section. So it depends on what you're doing too, and there's certainly an overlap, and you can get the specific books down in the general reading room, but again, you sort of have to get familiar with that place too.
Well, I was just in the genealogy or the geography section the other day because I am getting ready to do a talk on the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I ended up doing pulling a map, and I found it, and it is from the Army. And what they ended up doing is on this map, they have all of the camps listed across the United States.
Oh, wow.
And along with it, it has the camp numbers. So I am ecstatic because of my
We need
find.
to talk about that one later. But one of the other...
We've only got 3 minutes left, but there was a couple of other things we tossed around before. The dictionaries and the different types of dictionaries that there are. There are medical dictionaries. There's the Black's Law dictionaries. There's, what do you call it, Tabor? Something?
Tabor's is a medical term dictionary, and it gives the name of the disease as well as a little bit of a synopsis on it. And those are another issue where things change. I remember I use A to Zach by Barbara Jean Evans. And it's a historic genealogy and historical terms. And they have such a thing called milk sickness in it. And earlier death certificates may say milk sickness, and you're trying to figure out what is milk sickness. Well, this is a disease where people had eaten plants, okay, and they had very, very upset stomachs that they couldn't control, and it eventually led to death. So this is the kind of thing that you would find in these historic
It might
dictionaries.
be dehydration is what you might call it today.
Yes.
Yeah, I've often seen terms that, what in the world could that mean? And sometimes if you're doing something in a foreign language, it helps to have a really old dictionary where some of these terms are defined. I don't know that anything like that is on the web. I've used to use the Library of Congress that had Grimm Brothers lexicon of words, and in order to find a really old term.
But a great way to look for those is used bookstores.
Yeah.
You were talking about the fair that you went to.
I went to an antique fair. There were lots and lots, hundreds of antique dealers down in Southern Virginia. And we went from one to the other, and then there was one other antique store. I saw they don't have books. We walked in, the whole store must have had 5 books, and it had this 1880 German-English dictionary, which proved invaluable to me, because even that one said, this term is obsolete, but it still listed it, and it was the word that I was looking for. So I think we can conclude in saying that, there's a lot of lists out there and a lot of different kinds of things that we never in general think about, because they're not the
run-of-the-mill sources we use.
You think of birth certificates and death certificates, but there's a lot of other things, and sometimes it's just a matter of knowing where to look for some of these things. Some of these dictionaries, again, you would find at perhaps a used book sale or something like that?
You could do that, or else, again, going back to your local library.
And they
would have them. These used book sales, a lot of the times in the spring, many organizations will have book sales. Go plow through them. Yeah. You may find something really unique.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it, and I think we've hopefully helped some people in giving them some ideas of where to look for something.
Thank you.